The moment Mamie Langston stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, she knew with absolute certainty that at least 3 men on the main street were about to underestimate her, and she had already decided she did not mind one bit, because underestimation was a tool she had learned to use like a scalpel. The town of Caldwell sat at the edge of everything, at the edge of the settled world and the raw, breathing wildness of the Indian Territory just south of the Kansas border, at the edge of cattle country and farming country, at the edge of law and the particular lawlessness that grew up in the gaps between sheriffs and marshals and the vast, indifferent sky. It was a cattle town in full spring roar, the long drives pushing north from Texas already putting dust on the horizon, and the saloons were already doing the kind of business that made decent people walk faster past their swinging doors. Mamie was 24 years old, and she had come from St. Louis with $40 sewn into the hem of her traveling coat, a leather satchel full of medicinal supplies, and a letter of introduction from Dr. Elias Rourke of the Missouri Medical Society, recommending her as a trained nurse and herbalist of considerable skill. She had no husband, no father waiting for her, and no particular illusions about what a woman alone in a cattle town would face. What she had instead was a plan. The plan was simple. Dr. Harold Fitch, Caldwell's only physician, had written to Dr. Rourke requesting assistance during the busy cattle season when injuries and illness multiplied faster than one man could manage. Mamie had answered the advertisement. She had been hired by letter. She had come. What she had not accounted for was the sight of Matthew Monroe. She did not know his name yet when she first saw him. She only saw a man leaning against the post of the general store with his arms crossed over his chest, his hat pulled low, watching the street with the particular quality of stillness that belonged to men who had learned patience the hard way. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a worn canvas duster the color of dry earth, and there was a deputy's badge on his chest that caught the afternoon sun just enough to throw a small dart of light across the street. He had a jaw that looked carved rather than grown dark stubble along it, and eyes that she would later discover were the exact color of creek water in deep shade, not quite green, not quite gray, but something moving between the two. He was not looking at her. He was watching 2 cowboys who had come off the cattle trail and were having a disagreement near the water trough that looked like it might become something more than a disagreement. His body was completely relaxed, his weight easy on one hip, but Mamie, who had spent years reading patience, reading pain, reading the truth that bodies told when mouths would not saw the coiled readiness in him, the way his right hand hung just slightly apart from his hip, the way his shoulders were angled precisely to give him maximum visibility of the street in both directions. He was a man who expected trouble and had made peace with that expectation so thoroughly that it no longer made him tense. It had become simply the water he swam in. Mamie picked up her satchel and went to find Dr. Fitch. Dr. Harold Fitch was 62, short, round, and possessed of the magnificent white mustache of a man who had given up on most vanities and adopted one spectacular one. He met her at the door of his office on the north end of Main Street and shook her hand with the firm grip of a man who had long since decided that a woman who could sew a wound and compound a tincture was worth 10 men who could not, regardless of what the social order had to say about it. "Miss Langston," he said, "you're younger than I expected." "You're older than I expected," she replied pleasantly, and he laughed so hard he had to wipe his eyes, and from that moment they understood each other perfectly. He showed her the examining room, the supply shelves, the small room at the back where she would sleep, which was narrow but clean, and had a window that faced east so she would have morning light. He showed her his record books and explained the current patients: 2 cowboys with infected rope burns, a farmer's wife with a difficult pregnancy, a barkeep named Schultz who refused to stop drinking, despite a liver complaint that was going to kill him eventually, and an Apache man named Runs Far who had come in 3 weeks ago with a bullet wound in his shoulder from circumstances that Dr. Fitch described with a meaningful silence that told Mamie the circumstances were complicated and probably involved the ongoing brutal displacement of the Apache people that the government continued to prosecute with grim efficiency across the territories. The deputy brings him supplies sometimes, Dr. Fitch said. Monroe, Matthew Monroe, you'll meet him. Is the deputy kind to him? Mamie asked because it mattered. Dr. Fitch considered this. He is fair, he said finally. Which in this town at this time is more than most men manage. That night Mamie lay in her narrow bed and listened to the sounds of Caldwell settling into its nighttime self, the distant music from the saloon, the occasional shout, the cry of something wild out in the dark beyond the town's edge, the creak of the building around her. She thought about the $40 sewn into her coat, which she had already moved to a hidden pocket of her satchel. She thought about what it meant to build something real from almost nothing in a place that had not asked for her arrival. She thought, briefly and without quite meaning to, about a man with creek-water eyes who had held himself like a coiled spring at rest. She put that thought away firmly and went to sleep. She met him properly 3 days later. She was kneeling in the alley beside Dr. Fitch's office, harvesting wild chamomile that grew along the building's foundation, when a shadow fell over her, and she looked up to find Deputy Matthew Monroe standing at the alley's entrance with a paper-wrapped parcel in his hands, looking at her with the same quality of watchful assessment he had been giving the street when she first saw him, except now it was directed entirely at her. "You're the nurse," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said. "And you're the deputy." He looked at the plants she was gathering. "What are those for?" "Chamomile tea, for runs far. His sleep is troubled." She stood, brushing soil from her skirt. "Dr. Fitch tells me you've been bringing him supplies." Matthew Monroe's expression did not change exactly, but something in it shifted, a very slight compression of the eyes, a tightening at the corners of his mouth. If she had not been watching closely, she would have missed it entirely. It was the expression of a man who did not want to be thanked for something and was bracing against the incoming gratitude. "He doesn't have anyone else," Matthew said. "No," Mamie agreed, not offering the thanks he was bracing against because she could see he didn't want it. "Will you bring those supplies in? I can show you where to put them." Something moved in his face again, surprise, she thought, very brief and quickly covered. He was not accustomed to people reading him well enough to know what he needed before he asked for it. He followed her inside without another word. He came back the next day, and the day after that. It was not always about supplies for runs far. Sometimes it was to check on the 2 cowboys with the rope burns, because they were from a ranch south of town, and the rancher had asked the deputy to keep an eye on his men. Sometimes it was because Dr. Fitch needed a word with him about some matter of town business that touched on his duties. But Mamie noticed, and she was very good at noticing, that he came even on the days when there was no particular official reason, and on those days he would find something to do that was useful, fixing a shelf that had grown loose, carrying water from the pump, sitting quietly at the table while she worked and speaking in short sentences when she spoke and not speaking when she didn't. He was not a man who spoke of feelings. She understood this within the first week of knowing him. It was not coldness. She could see it was not coldness. It was something more like a profound uncertainty about what words could do, a lifelong experience of feelings being too large and complicated for language to carry without breaking. He had learned instead to speak in actions, in presence, in the particular quality of attention he gave to the things and people that mattered to him. She was not a woman who needed him to speak of them. She could read every movement. The way he positioned himself between her and the door when a drunk cowboy came into the office making noise, not stepping in front of her, not treating her like she couldn't handle herself, but placing himself at the angle that would give him the fastest response time if things turned bad, like a man who'd calculated threats and distances without thinking about it. The way he handed her things, a cup of coffee he'd brought from the cafe across the street, a piece of information about a patient's background that he thought might be medically relevant with a small, careful deliberateness, as if the act of handing something to her deserved to be done well. The way he watched her work. Not intrusively, not with the uncomfortable scrutiny of a man cataloging a woman's movements for purposes she hadn't consented to, but with the focused attention of a man watching something that he found genuinely excellent, the same way a person watches a skilled craftsman at work, with a quiet recognition that they are in the presence of something worth paying attention to. Mamie noticed all of this. She filed it away in the part of her mind that was always observing, always interpreting, always building a picture of the truth behind the surface of things. And what the picture told her was this: Matthew Monroe was a man who had been alone for a long time and had grown so comfortable in his solitude that he had nearly forgotten it was loneliness. He was a man who had learned to keep the world at a manageable distance because distance was safe. And he was a man who, despite all of that careful management, kept showing up in her doorway for reasons he would not have been able to articulate if someone had put a gun to his head. She was not going to make it easy for him. Not because she was cruel or enjoyed watching him navigate his own discomfort, but because she could see that he needed the slow approach, the way you needed to move slowly near a horse that had been spooked too many times. Rush it and you'd lose it entirely. Give it time and space and consistency, and eventually it would come to you on its own terms. She did make him coffee in return, once she had sourced the beans from the general store and learned where Dr. Fitch kept his pot. She did not make a ceremony of it. She just handed it to him one morning when he came in, and she watched the surprise move through him again, quicker this time, better concealed, but still there, and she went back to what she was doing. The town of Caldwell in the spring of 1878 was a complicated place to be. The cattle trade brought money, and it brought chaos in roughly equal measure, and the law was a thin and often disputed line that Deputy Matthew Monroe and Sheriff Amos Webb walked every day with varying degrees of success. Sheriff Webb was a competent man and a fair one, but he was also 60 years old and had been hit by a horse the previous winter in a way that had left his left knee unpredictable, and there were days when Matthew was effectively the only law in Caldwell from sunup to sundown. Mamie saw what this cost him. She saw it in the set of his shoulders at the end of long days, in the way he sometimes sat at the table in Dr. Fitch's office and did not speak and did not move for 10 minutes while he worked through something inside himself that he could not put into words. She never pressed him on those days. She would bring him coffee or set food in front of him if it was near a meal time, and she would continue working nearby, and the companionable quiet between them would do the work that words could not. It was on one of those evenings, 6 weeks after her arrival in Caldwell, that she first understood that she was in real danger of falling in love with him, which was inconvenient and poorly timed, and possibly the most honest thing she had felt since she was a girl. She was at the work table compounding a poultice for the farmer's wife, whose pregnancy had entered a difficult final stretch and whose ankles were swelling badly. Matthew was at the table behind her. The evening light was coming through the window at a low angle, turning everything amber and gold, and she was aware of him the way she was becoming increasingly aware of him, as a specific gravity in a room, a warm, specific weight of presence that she felt on the back of her neck and along her arms even when she wasn't looking at him. "My father was a farmer," she said, not because it was relevant to the poultice, but because the silence had reached a particular quality that invited it. "In Illinois. He died when I was 16. We lost the farm after." She was not looking at him. She kept her hands moving through the ingredients on the work table. She heard him shift in his chair behind her, the small creak of wood, and she felt the quality of his attention change, deepen, focus, become the kind of listening that was almost physical. "My mother took us to St. Louis," she continued. "My sister and me. She did laundry and sewing. I found work at a hospital. Not as a nurse, they wouldn't have that, but as an aide. I worked there for 4 years and I learned everything I could, and then Dr. Rourke took me on as a proper student and I learned everything else." A long pause. Then Matthew's voice, low and careful, feeling its way, Why Caldwell? She smiled at the work table. Because he had asked. Because he wanted to know. Because it needed someone, she said, and because I needed somewhere that needed someone. Another pause, longer this time. She finished the poultice and set it aside to cure, and turned around to find him looking at her with those creekwater eyes from under the brim of his hat, which he had pushed back slightly, and his expression was completely open in a way that she had not yet seen on his face, unguarded and unashamed of being so, for just a handful of seconds before he caught himself and reordered his features into something more composed. But she had seen it. She filed it away in that careful, observing part of her mind, and what it told her was that Matthew Monroe, for all his careful distance and his economy of words, was a man whose interior life was vast and deep and largely untraveled, and that the look on his face in that unguarded moment was the look of a man recognizing something important without yet knowing what to do with the recognition. "Where are you from?" she asked, because fairness demanded reciprocity, and because she wanted to know. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Texas, near Amarillo, not a farmer, ranching, my family's ranch." "You left," a muscle moved in his jaw, "eventually." She let it sit. She did not push. She could see there was a whole geography of history behind that one word, eventually, with mountains and valleys and things that had happened that had made leaving the only possible direction. She stored it away and waited for the rest of it to come in its own time. It came in pieces over the following weeks, the way things always did with men like him. Not in a single confession or an outpouring, but in small installments, offered sideways, often while he was doing something else, the words arriving as if they hadn't quite intended to leave his mouth and had gotten out while his defenses were occupied with other things. His family's ranch had been worked by his father and two older brothers. He had been the youngest, which meant the least land and the least say and the most work. There had been a woman. He said this one afternoon while fixing the loose hinge on the office door, not looking at Mamie, his voice completely flat, and even a woman in Amarillo he had intended to marry when he was 22. She had married his brother instead, the older one, the one who would eventually inherit the largest share. Matthew had left Texas at 23 and had not gone back. He was now 31. He said none of this in sequence. He said it in fragments, weeks apart, and Mamie assembled the fragments into a whole the way she assembled symptoms into diagnosis, with patience and precision, and a particular kind of intelligence that was not about cleverness so much as about paying exquisite attention. What the whole told her was this: Matthew Monroe had spent 8 years building a life out of discipline and duty and the careful avoidance of wanting things, because wanting things had cost him badly once, and he had decided, at some level so deep he probably didn't think of it as a decision, that it was not worth the risk. He was good at his work. He was respected in Caldwell. He was known as fair and capable and harder to rattle than a stone wall. And he was, underneath all of that, a man shaped like a closed door who had completely forgotten that doors were meant to open. Mamie had spent her whole life reading people. She had read patients too frightened to describe their pain accurately. She had read doctors too proud to admit when they didn't know something. She had read her mother's hands moving over laundry in the early morning light, had read the economy of grief in the set of her shoulders, had learned that the truest things people felt were almost never the things they said, but always the things they did, the way they moved through space, the small unconscious choreography of living. She read Matthew Monroe the way she read all of it, and what she read made something ache in her chest that she had not felt in a long time, and had not expected to feel in a cattle town on the edge of the Kansas plains. It was in the middle of June when things changed, or perhaps more accurately, when things that had already changed between them became impossible to pretend otherwise. A cattle drive had come up from Texas, the Comstock herd, 600 head and 12 cowboys, and arrived in Caldwell in the way that cattle drives always arrived in Caldwell, which was loud and dusty and bristling with the particular volatile energy of men who had spent 3 months on the trail and were ready to spend their wages in a single spectacular evening. Sheriff Webb was bedridden with his knee. Matthew was managing the main street largely alone. Mamie was working in the office when she heard the shot. It was a single shot down the street, followed by a period of silence that was somehow louder than the shot had been, and then a rising sound of voices. She was at the door with her satchel before Dr. Fitch had risen from his chair. "Mamie," he started. "I'll be careful," she said, and she was out the door. What she found on the street was a cowboy named Hector Briggs who had taken a shot to the upper arm, not life-threatening but bleeding considerably, and Matthew Monroe standing between Briggs and a group of 4 other cowboys who had come to collect on behalf of their friend, their hands near their holsters, their faces bright with the particular kind of whiskey-fueled righteousness that was genuinely more dangerous than cold-blooded anger, because it was so much less predictable. Matthew was not speaking. He was standing very still in the middle of the street with his hands at his sides, and his badge catching the torchlight and his face utterly, completely calm, and he was looking at the 4 cowboys with an expression that Mamie would later spend considerable time trying to describe to herself, and would only be able to characterize as the expression of a man who has looked at dangerous situations so many times that danger has become simply information, something to be assessed rather than reacted to. The cowboys were talking. She could not hear all of it from where she stood, but she heard enough: the name of the man who had fired the shot and was now cooling in the jail, the demand for his release, the suggestion that Matthew's continued well-being depended on the speed of his compliance. Matthew listened to all of it. He let them finish. He did not move. Then he said something, too quietly for Mamie to hear, something short, maybe a single sentence, and the quality of the air on the street changed. One of the 4 cowboys took a small step backward, then another. The body language of the group shifted like a tide going out, and then they were dispersing, not happily but definitely dispersing, going back toward the saloon with the deflated anger of men who had run up against something that wasn't going to give way, and had recognized it too late to save face completely. Mamie went to Hector Briggs and knelt beside him, and began working on his arm with the brisk efficiency that had become her natural mode in any medical situation. She was aware of Matthew moving to stand near her, not hovering, not getting in the way, just present, giving her the buffer of his presence between her and the remaining cowboys who were watching from a distance. When she had the wound cleaned and bound, and had helped Briggs up and sent him in the direction of Dr. Fitch's office with instructions about the dressing, she stood and turned to find Matthew watching her with that particular quality of focused attention she had come to know, the one that felt like being seen all the way through. "What did you say to them?" she asked. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but something adjacent to one. That their friend had fired first, and that jail was the kindest thing that was going to happen to him tonight, and that if they kept at it, they'd be joining him, and none of them would see their pay. "Did you believe you could have stopped all 4 of them if they'd gone for their guns?" A pause. "No," he said, with the same flat, even tone he always used for the truth, "but I believed they thought I could." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her. The torchlight moved between them on the warm June air, and she felt the ache in her chest sharpen into something more specific, something she recognized and could name, and she decided in that moment that she was tired of waiting for him to find his way to the door. "Come have coffee," she said. "You look like you need it." He came. They sat at the table in Dr. Fitch's office well past midnight, the old doctor long since gone to bed, the town quieting down around them, and they talked, actually talked, in a way they had not done before, not the careful exchange of information that had been their mode, but something looser and more genuine, something that moved in both directions without the usual careful controls. He told her about the drive cattle up from Texas at 17, the first time he'd seen the open plains, how it had felt like the world cracking open to show him a size he hadn't known existed. She told him about her first surgical observation, a battlefield surgeon she had read about who had inspired her to seek out every medical book she could find in St. Louis, about the particular fierce love she had developed for the work of healing, for the idea that human knowledge could be turned toward the project of reducing suffering. He told her, with the careful, slow cadence of a man moving through difficult territory, about the woman in Amarillo. Her name was Clara. He had thought she loved him. He had been wrong. He did not say this with self-pity. There was no self-pity in him that she could find, but with the flat acknowledgement of a fact that had required considerable time and silence to metabolize, and had left him permanently cautious about the whole enterprise of hoping for things. "Do you still think about her?" Mamie asked. "No," he said, immediately and without hesitation. "Not for years." A pause, and then, because the late hour and the coffee and the unusual openness between them were combining to produce a frankness he wouldn't normally allow himself. "I think about other things instead." He was looking at the table when he said it, not at her, and the tips of his ears had gone a color that was not precisely visible in the lamplight, but that she was fairly certain was red, and she felt a rush of something warm and enormous move through her chest at the sight of it. This man who held his ground against 4 armed cowboys without flinching, sitting at her table with his ears going red because he had admitted to thinking about her, which was clearly what he meant and what they both knew he meant. "Good," she said softly. He looked up. She was looking directly at him. She let him see exactly what was in her face, not coy, not performing, just honest, because she had decided she was done waiting, and honest was the only approach that was going to work with a man like this, a man who spoke in actions and would need to see something real before he could respond to it. Something moved through his face that she had no precise word for. It was not surprise this time. It was something older and more substantial, a kind of careful, wondering recognition, the expression of a man who has been in the dark for a long time and has just seen a light and is not yet sure if he is allowed to move toward it. "Mamie," he said, and the way he said her name with the same quality of deliberateness he brought to everything, like it was something worth doing correctly, made her extremely still for a moment. "Go home, Matthew," she said. "Get some sleep. Come back tomorrow." He went. He came back the next morning with 2 cups of coffee from the cafe and a slightly stunned look around the eyes that she found entirely endearing. July came, and with it the full heat of the Kansas summer and a new difficulty. A fever had started moving through the cattle camps at the edge of town, and within a week it had spread to the town itself. It was not the worst thing Mamie had ever seen. She had read accounts of the great cholera epidemics and the yellow fever outbreaks in the South, and she knew what a real catastrophe looked like, but it was serious, and it stretched her and Dr. Fitch to the edges of their capacity and then a little beyond. She was working 18-hour days, moving between the office and the sick rooms of the families in town who could not come to her, compounding medicines, managing fevers, monitoring the cases that tipped toward dangerous and nursing them back toward safe. She was exhausted in a way that was physical and deep, the kind of tired that lived in the bones. Matthew, during those weeks, became something that she would only find words for later, looking back. He could not help with the medicine, that was beyond his skills, but he could help with everything else, and he did. He carried water. He ran messages between patients when she was too occupied to move from a bedside. He sat with frightened children in the waiting room so their parents could rest. He brought food from the cafe and set it in front of her without comment at intervals that she later realized were precisely calculated to the moments when she had been going longest without eating. He did not speak of what he was doing. He did not name it. He simply showed up every day and did what was needed, and was there, and the being there was the thing she needed most, and the thing she could not have asked for because she had not known how to ask for it. The fever broke in the community at large at the end of the 3rd week. They lost 2 people, an elderly man named Grafton who had been in poor health already, and a young cowboy from the trail who had been too sick when he arrived for intervention to help. Mamie mourned them both with the particular quiet grief of a healer who has learned that death is part of the work, but who has never made peace with it and does not intend to. The evening after the last critical patient was downgraded to recovery, she sat on the step of Dr. Fitch's office in the cooling air and was too tired to move. Matthew came and sat beside her, not at a polite distance. Beside her, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, and she was aware of the warmth of him and the solid realness of him in a way that was almost overwhelming when she was this tired. She leaned her head against his shoulder without deciding to. She just did it because her neck was tired and he was there, and it was where she wanted to be. He went completely still for a moment. Then slowly, carefully, like a man handling something he was afraid of breaking, he raised his arm and put it around her shoulders, and she felt the weight of it settle around her, and something inside her chest that had been wound very tight for 3 weeks released all at once. They sat like that until the stars were out and the town had gone quiet around them. He did not speak of feelings. She did not need him to. August arrived burning and relentless, and with it, the return of a problem that Matthew had been managing with quiet vigilance all summer. A man named Cutter Walsh had come to Caldwell in early June and had been making himself progressively more at home in the ways that men like Cutter Walsh always did through money, through association with the rougher elements of the cattle trade, and through a studied avoidance of anything that the law could formally object to while doing things that the law could clearly smell but not yet touch. Walsh wanted land. He was buying it up from struggling homesteaders south of town at prices that were not quite low enough to be called robbery, but were certainly not generous. And there were rumors that the persuasion he applied to reluctant sellers involved methods that went well beyond paper and ink. 2 homesteaders had come to Matthew separately, both of them nervous, both of them unwilling to make a formal complaint, and Matthew had listened to them with the careful patience he brought to everything, and had filed what they said in that interior place, where he kept the things that required long, patient attention before they resolved into action. Mamie knew about Walsh because she had treated one of those homesteaders, a man named Clyde Ferris, for bruised ribs that he claimed he had sustained falling from a wagon, and she had seen the pattern of the bruising, and known that a wagon did not produce bruises in exactly that geometry, and she had told him quietly and without accusation that whatever had happened, she hoped he knew he could come back to her, and he had not met her eyes when he thanked her and left. She told Matthew about Clyde Ferris that evening. She did not tell him what she thought had happened or what she thought he should do about it. He was the law, and it was his work to decide that. She simply told him what she had observed, and he listened the way he always listened, completely and without interruption, his eyes on her face and his expression giving nothing away. "He won't make a complaint," Matthew said when she finished. "No," she agreed. "He won't." Another silence. "I'll keep watching," he said. "I know," she said. "That's all I wanted to tell you." He looked at her for a moment with something in his eyes that she was becoming more and more able to name, though she was patient with the naming of it and let it take the time it needed. "You trust me to handle it," he said. "I trust you to handle most things," she said. "Yes." The way he absorbed this was interesting to watch. He was a man who was not accustomed to being trusted, she thought, not in the simple, unguarded way she offered it. The people who relied on his authority trusted the badge. The people who feared him trusted the competence. But what she was giving him was something different, something personal, and he received it the way he received everything she gave him, with that careful deliberateness that was its own form of tenderness. The Walsh situation came to a head in late August when Walsh made the mistake of escalating against a homesteader who had more spine than the others. A woman named Ruth Alderman, who had built her place south of town after her husband died, and had been farming it alone for 3 years, and was not in the least bit interested in Cutter Walsh's money or his implied threats. Ruth Alderman came to Caldwell on a Tuesday morning and walked directly to the sheriff's office with a freshly bruised face and her chin up, and told Matthew Monroe exactly what had happened, and exactly what Walsh's man had said to her, and signed her name to a formal complaint with a hand that did not tremble. Mamie happened to be at the sheriff's office when Ruth arrived. She had come to check on a prisoner who had a concerning cough, and she treated Ruth's bruised face while Matthew wrote down everything Ruth said. And she watched Ruth and Matthew in that room and felt something fierce and proud at the sight of both of them. This woman who had decided that enough was enough, and this man who was receiving her testimony with the complete focused seriousness it deserved, and already, she could see, calculating what came next. What came next took 4 days and involved Matthew riding south of town to gather additional witness accounts from the Ferris family and 2 other homesteaders who, emboldened by Ruth Alderman's example, were now willing to speak. It involved a conversation between Matthew and Sheriff Webb that left Webb grim-faced and decisive. It involved the arrival of a federal marshal named Cade from Wichita, who had been looking for a reason to come to Caldwell for other reasons connected to Walsh's activities that went considerably beyond land acquisition. Cutter Walsh was arrested on a Friday morning in front of the Drover's House Hotel by Federal Marshal Cade, with Matthew standing at the marshal's right shoulder in the capacity that the marshal had explicitly requested, because Walsh was known to make sudden decisions when cornered and Matthew Monroe was known to be difficult to move without consent. Walsh tried to buy his way out. Then he tried to threaten his way out. Neither approach worked on Marshal Cade, who was a compact, unimpressible man with 20 years of federal service and no particular interest in what Cutter Walsh wanted. Walsh looked at Matthew during the whole proceeding with the flat hostility of a man who knew who had built the case against him and was making promises he intended to keep. Matthew met his gaze without blinking and said nothing. He was quiet that evening when he came to the office. Mamie set food in front of him and sat across the table and did not speak until he was ready. "He'll have friends in Leavenworth," he said eventually. "He will," she agreed. "It might not stick. It might not." She folded her hands on the table. "But Ruth Alderman is still on her farm, and Clyde Ferris still has his land, and Walsh is out of Caldwell." A long pause. "That's true. You did good work," she said. He looked at her, and then he did something he had never done before. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, carefully, the way he did everything, his large rough hand covering both of hers, and left it there. He was looking at the tabletop, but the touch was completely deliberate and entirely intentional, and said, with precision and clarity, everything he would not put into words. She turned her hand over under his and held on. September in Caldwell had a golden quality to it, the light changing as the summer bled into fall, the heat releasing its grip gradually, the plains turning colors that Mamie had not expected and found breathtaking. The cattle season was winding down, the big drives over, the town settling into its quieter autumn self. She had been in Caldwell for 6 months. She had treated hundreds of patients. She had helped Dr. Fitch through the fever outbreak, managed a difficult birth that had ended safely, the farmer's wife and her new son both healthy and home, and had begun to establish herself in the town's mind as something more than a novelty, a woman doctor adjacent who actually knew what she was doing. She had also, in the honest privacy of her own thoughts, fallen comprehensively and irrevocably in love with Matthew Monroe, which was inconvenient only in the sense that he had not yet said anything about it directly, though she knew with the certainty of a woman who could read every movement that the feeling was not one-directional. She had begun to understand the shape of his love the way she understood the shape of other things, in evidence, in pattern, in the accumulated weight of small, consistent truths. The way he always made sure she had eaten. The way he positioned himself between her and anything he perceived as a threat, not overbearingly, not in a way that implied she couldn't manage herself, but with the instinctive protectiveness of a man for whom protecting this particular person had become a priority at some level below conscious thought. The way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, she was always watching. She was constitutionally incapable of not watching with an expression that was completely unguarded and entirely unambiguous. He loved her. He just hadn't found the words for it yet, and she was beginning to think that perhaps she was the one who was going to have to provide the occasion. The occasion came on a September evening when the plains were going gold and red, and the air had the first bite of fall in it, and they were sitting on the step of the office again, which had become their place, the specific geography of their particular companionship, and the sunset was doing something extraordinary over the western plain, all orange and crimson and the deep purple of oncoming dark. "I'm thinking about staying," she said. He was very still beside her. "Dr. Fitch has asked me to stay on through winter, and she looked at the sunset. "I find that I have reasons to want to." She paused. "I want you to know that." The silence stretched out long enough that she could hear her own heartbeat, and the sound of the evening wind moving through the grass at the edge of town. Then Matthew shifted beside her and turned to face her, and she turned to face him, and they were very close in the September light, and she could see every detail of his face, the lines at the corners of his eyes that she had come to associate with weather and vigilance, the way the evening light caught in the gray at his temples, the way his jaw was set with the effort of someone trying to make sure they say the right thing. "I want you to stay," he said. The words came out careful and deliberate and stripped of all pretense, the words of a man who does not say things lightly and is saying this with everything he has. He stopped, started again. "You are," another stop, and she could see him struggling, the man who did not speak of feelings running up against a feeling too large to navigate around. "I can't say it the way it should be said," he said finally. "I'm not good at this." "Matthew," she said. He looked at her. "I know," she said. "I've known for months." She touched his face, just her palm against his jaw, gentle, the way she would touch something precious, and watched what happened to his expression at the contact, which was the most open thing she had ever seen on a human face, undefended and clear and full of something that had been behind the closed door for 8 years waiting for the right door to open it. "I don't need the words." "You deserve the words," he said. "Then find them," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He put his hand over hers where it rested against his jaw, holding it there. "I love you," he said, like a man finding something he had forgotten he'd lost, surprised by it, grateful and entirely certain. "I have for a while. I don't know exactly when it started. I just know I can't think about this town or this," he stopped, found the word, "this life, without thinking about you being in it." Mamie felt the thing in her chest that had been aching and coiled and waiting bloom open like something that had been waiting for warmth. She leaned forward and kissed him, there on the step in the September light, and he kissed her back with the same quality of careful deliberateness that he brought to everything important. And it was exactly right, exactly what it was supposed to be. And the sunset continued doing its extraordinary business over the western plain, and neither of them paid it any attention. Autumn passed in a way that Mamie would later remember as the most consistently happy stretch of time in her life, which surprised her a little because it was also hard work. The season brought its own medical challenges, chest ailments and injuries from the harvest and the general occupational hazards of life on the Kansas plains, and she and Dr. Fitch were busy most days from early morning. But there was Matthew, appearing at the beginning and end of each day with the reliable fidelity of the sun. There were the evenings that had become theirs in an unspoken way, sitting on the step or inside at the table, or sometimes, on Sundays when the work permitted, walking out to the edge of town where the plains opened up, and she could see all the way to the horizon and feel the scale of the world she had come to. He showed her things about the plains that she would not have noticed on her own, the way certain grasses bent to show the direction of coming weather, the bird calls that meant different things, the patterns of behavior in horses and cattle that told you what they knew about the land they were on. He had come to know this country through years of riding it, and he offered its knowledge to her with the same unhurried generosity with which he offered everything. She showed him things too. She showed him how to compound basic wound care, how to recognize the early signs of infection, what plants growing along the creek beds were medicinal and which were merely beautiful. She told him about anatomy and physiology in terms he found genuinely fascinating, about how the body worked and defended itself and healed. He was an attentive student, asking the precise kind of question that told her he was actually thinking about what she said rather than merely waiting for her to finish. They were learning each other, she thought. That was what this was. The slow, detailed, endlessly interesting work of learning another person, and she found that he was the most interesting person she had encountered in a life that had not, so far, lacked for interesting people. He told her more of Texas, in the gradual installment method that she had come to recognize and appreciate. He told her about his mother, who had been a practical and clear-eyed woman who had managed the ranch with capable efficiency, while his father attended to the aspects of it he found more interesting, which were mostly the cattle trading and not the daily grind of maintaining the land. She had died when Matthew was 19, 3 years before he left, and he had missed her in a way he described with careful understatement that Mamie recognized as meaning the loss had been enormous and had only partially healed. He told her about the years after he had left Texas, the drifting, the cattle work, the various towns and their various sheriffs who had offered him work, because he had a quality that was useful in uncertain places, that particular quality of steadiness under pressure that could not be manufactured or taught, but only born from a combination of temperament and experience. He had ended up in Caldwell 3 years ago, and had found it to be the kind of place that held him, though he would not have been able to say exactly why, and she thought she understood that it was partly geography and partly the nature of the work, and partly something about the town itself that was still becoming itself, still in the process of being shaped, which suited a man who had his own ongoing process of becoming. He had become, in those 3 years, a fixture and a force in Caldwell, the man you called when things were difficult, the man whose presence on the street made the worst of the incoming cowboys recalibrate their plans, the man who brought supplies to runs far and fixed the loose hinges on the medical office door and noticed when the step had developed a dangerous soft spot and repaired it without being asked. He had become, in the past 6 months, hers, and she had become his. They both understood this without having conducted any formal transaction about it, which was entirely consistent with how both of them operated. Runs Far recovered fully from his shoulder wound and left Caldwell in October to rejoin his people in the South, and the morning he left he stopped at the office where Mamie and Matthew were both present and said something in Apache to Matthew that Matthew received with a nod and a handshake, the firm clasp of two people who respected each other, and then turned to Mamie and said in English simply, "Good woman." She thanked him and meant it entirely. When he had gone, Matthew told her what Runs Far had said in Apache, which translated roughly as, "Take care of what you have found, because some people go a whole life and don't find it." He said it with the same flat, even tone he always used for information, but she could see that the words had struck him somewhere real, and she took his hand, and they stood at the office door watching the direction Runs Far had gone for a long, quiet moment. It was in November, with the first cold coming down from the north, and the cattle drives long finished and Caldwell settling into its winter pace, that Matthew asked her to marry him. He did it in the way she might have predicted, which was to say without ceremony or planned occasion, in the middle of an ordinary evening at the table with the lamp lit and coffee on, and the wind picking up outside the walls of the office. He had been quiet for a stretch, not his troubled quiet but his thinking quiet, the one she recognized as processing something large, and then he set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly in the way he only did when he was about to say something that mattered. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know," she said, "about us." He found the word after a brief search. "About what we are to each other." "And what are we?" she asked, not because she didn't know but because she wanted to hear him say it. "Everything," he said simply, and it cost him something to say it, she could see that, and the cost made it worth more. "You are everything to me, Mamie." He stopped, and she could see him doing what he always did when words failed, reaching for actions instead. And in this case, the action was to reach into his coat pocket and produce something that turned out to be a ring. A plain silver band that was not elaborate or expensive, but was clearly bought with thought, chosen carefully. And the sight of it, and the sight of his hand holding it out to her with that look on his face, undefended, entirely certain. The closed door, completely open, made her throat close up in a way that she had not expected. "Will you marry me?" he said. Not performed as a question, not flourished or decorated, just offered to her straight and direct and real, the way he offered everything real. "I can't say it as well as it should be said, but everything I have and everything I am, I want it to be yours. Will you have it?" "Yes," she said just as simply. "I'll have it, all of it." He put the ring on her finger and she held his hand afterward, and neither of them spoke for some time, and the wind moved around the building, and the lamp burned steady, and everything was, in that moment, exactly as it should be. "Doctor." Fitch cried when they told him the next morning, which he covered by blowing his nose vigorously into his handkerchief, and claiming it was dust. And Mamie hugged him because she knew it was not dust, and she loved him for the feeling and for the cover story in equal measure. Sheriff Webb shook Matthew's hand, and then, in an unprecedented display of emotion for a man whose face generally registered approximately 3 expressions, shook it again. They were married in December, 2 weeks before Christmas, in the small church on the north end of Caldwell that smelled like pine and cold air and old wood. The preacher was a young man from Ohio who had come to the territory with the particular earnest energy of someone who believed that civilization was something you built by showing up and doing the work, which was a belief Mamie found she had considerable sympathy with. He read the words carefully and with feeling, and she and Matthew said the responses to each other facing each other directly, and she watched his face while he said them, and he watched her face while she said them, and the whole thing was witnessed by Dr. Fitch and Sheriff Webb and Ruth Alderman, who had driven up from her farm for the occasion, and a handful of townsfolk who had come because they had been watching the slow gravitational pull between the deputy and the nurse for months and were invested in the outcome. When the preacher said what he had to say and Matthew kissed her with his characteristic care and completeness, the sort of kiss that was entirely private in intent and also entirely visible to everyone in the small church, there was a sound from the assembled witnesses that was approximately equal parts applause and relief. The winter they spent together in the small house Matthew had taken at the edge of town was the foundation of what they were building, and it was, Mamie thought, the best winter she had ever had. Not because it was easy, it was a hard winter, cold that came in hard from the north and settled in, and the work did not stop because the season changed. There were still patients and still the daily requirements of living in a place that had not yet been fully tamed. But because of the texture of it, the dailiness of sharing a life with someone who understood her so completely and who she understood in return. She learned the rhythms of him in the way that you only learn someone when you live beside them. The way he started the day slowly, needing quiet before words. The way he became most talkative in the evenings when the day's work had released him into something softer. The way he slept on his back with one arm thrown over his head like a man who had learned to claim space after years of giving it up. The way he woke instantly when there was any sound that shouldn't be there, and was completely awake before she had registered that she'd heard it, which was a quality she found both reassuring and slightly remarkable. He learned her in return, her tendency to work past the point of good sense when something had caught her attention, which required him to occasionally appear beside her with food or the firm, gentle suggestion that the problem would still be there after she slept. Her habit of narrating her thinking aloud when she was working through something difficult, which he had apparently learned to find charming rather than distracting. Her particular quality of stillness when she was reading someone, which he had told her once, in one of his rare extended moments of expressiveness, was the most completely focused attention he had ever experienced, and that it sometimes made him feel simultaneously very seen and very glad to be seen. Spring came back around to Caldwell, the first spring of their married life, and Mamie realized in March that she was pregnant. She had not spoken of it yet when Matthew figured it out, which did not surprise her at all and which she would have bet money on when she thought about it. He noticed everything. He had been noticing her for a year. He noticed the changes in her before she had finished confirming them to herself, the small shifts in her patterns, the mornings that required her to sit quietly before she could stand, the way her attention moved when it hadn't before. He said nothing about it. He just made things easier, quietly and without explanation, adjusted the supply shelves so the heavy things were more accessible, made sure there was always food ready in the morning before she was up, took on things she had been doing that required physical strain. She watched him do all of this and felt the familiar warmth of being known, the specific comfort of a man who expressed love in the language of taken care of, and she waited. He asked her about it one evening in April, with the plains showing the first green of the season outside the window of their small house, and she told him. She watched his face carefully in the moment of telling, because she wanted to remember it. What she saw was not surprise, she had known it wouldn't be, but something moving through him that was large and quiet, the way a river moving underground is large and quiet, felt more than seen. He crossed the room and put his arms around her and held her very carefully, in the specific way that she had noticed he held her now, with a consciousness of the additional life they were carrying between them that she found beautiful, and he did not speak for a long time. When he did speak, his voice had the quality of a man who has found his way to a feeling he doesn't have perfect words for and is offering the words he has anyway. "I didn't think I'd have this," he said. "A life like this. I'd stopped expecting it." "I know," she said. "I'm glad I was wrong." Their son was born in October of 1879 in the warmth of the small house at the edge of Caldwell with Dr. Fitch attending and Matthew present in a way that Mamie had requested, and that Dr. Fitch had accommodated without comment because he was, underneath the spectacular mustache and the 62 years of medical practice, a man who understood that the old rigid protocols about who could be where during what occasions were not always in service of the people they were supposed to serve. Matthew held his son for the first time with the particular quality of stillness that Mamie recognized from 600 other moments. The stillness of a man so precisely focused on something that the rest of the world has ceased to register. The baby was wrapped in the blanket she had made over the long summer months, and Matthew held him with his big, careful hands, and his face did something she had never seen it do before, which was to simply and entirely give way to the feeling he was feeling. No management, no controlled response, just the full, unguarded truth of it. Wonder and love and a specific bewildered gratitude that moved across his features like weather. She watched this from the bed where she was resting and felt that everything in her life had arrived at the right destination. They named him James, after her father who had died when she was 16 in Illinois, and James Monroe arrived in the world with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, not quite green, not quite gray, but something moving between the two and the particular quality of watchful attention that Mamie thought privately probably came from both of them. By the time James was walking and getting into things with the focused determination of a small person who has recently discovered that the world is full of interesting objects that adults inexplicably do not want you to touch, Matthew had been promoted to sheriff of Caldwell. Sheriff Webb had retired at the end of 1879, his knee finally overruling his intentions, and the town council, which was not always a body that made its best decisions, had in this case made the obvious correct choice and offered the position to Matthew, who had taken it with the same absence of ceremony with which he approached most things, which was to say he had said yes, thanked them, and gone back to work. He was a good sheriff. He had always been a good lawman, but the added weight of the position suited him in a way that had less to do with the authority it conferred, and more to do with the responsibility it required. He was a man who took responsibility seriously, and who expanded rather than contracted under its weight. The town of Caldwell was changing, the wild years of the cattle boom beginning to smooth out into something more settled, and it needed a man who could navigate both the remaining roughness and the emerging civic dignity, and Matthew could do both with equal competence. Mamie had taken on a formal role at the medical office by then. Dr. Fitch had elevated her from nurse to formal partner in the practice, which required some creative interpretation of the applicable medical conventions for women in Kansas in 1880, but which Dr. Fitch accomplished with the particular determination of a man who had decided that what was right took precedence over what was conventional, and who had the professional standing to make it stick. She was known in Caldwell and in the surrounding homesteading community as the woman to see, and she had earned that knowledge through 4 years of showing up and doing the work. Ruth Alderman came to her for general health matters and had become, over time, a friend, one of the real ones, the kind built from mutual respect and shared history, and the specific bond of women who understood what it meant to hold their ground in a place that sometimes did not want to make room for them. Ruth's farm was prospering. She had taken on a hired hand, a quiet young man from Missouri who had arrived in the territory with good intentions and not much else, and who was learning the farm with the same earnest dedication that she applied to everything. The Ferris family had kept their land. Cutter Walsh had ultimately stood trial in Leavenworth and been convicted on the federal charges that Marshall Cade had built against him, charges that went considerably beyond what had happened in Caldwell and resulted in a sentence that would keep him unavailable for a very long time. Mamie had felt, when she heard this, a particular settling satisfaction, the kind that comes when a thing that needed to be resolved finally resolves. Their second child came in 1882, a girl they named Eleanor after Matthew's mother, and she arrived with her mother's coloring and her father's quality of stillness, and a personality that made itself apparent very early as the sort of personality that would require, over time, considerable negotiation. James was 3 when Eleanor arrived and greeted her with the solemn assessment of a small person who is not yet sure whether this development is positive, a position he maintained for approximately 2 weeks before it became entirely clear that Eleanor found him endlessly fascinating, at which point he revised his position completely and became her most dedicated companion. Matthew with his children was something Mamie did not have adequate words for, which was funny because she was not generally without words. He was with them the way he was with everything that mattered, fully present, attentive in the particular way that made people feel they were the only thing in the room, patient in a manner that surprised her a little even after years of knowing him, because it was so complete and so genuine. He taught James about horses with the same slow care with which he had once taught Mamie about the plains, and James received it with the intense focus of a boy who has found his particular fascination and is all in. He let Eleanor accompany him on his rounds of the town as soon as she was steady on her feet, and the sight of the tall, broad-shouldered sheriff of Caldwell walking his main street with a small, determined girl clutching 2 of his fingers and greeting every person they passed with the cheerful authority of someone who owned the world became one of the sights the town grew to love. The years passed, and Caldwell changed with them. The cattle trade wound down as the railheads moved, and the open range began to give way to fences and farms, and the steady pressure of settlement. The town settled into itself, became more itself, became the kind of place that had a school and a proper church and a women's social circle, and 2 newspapers and arguments at town council meetings about road improvements and water access, and all the ordinary preoccupations of a community becoming permanent. Mamie watched all of this with interest, and with the particular clarity of someone who had arrived at the beginning of it and had watched it happen. She had been part of it happening. The medical practice she and Dr. Fitch ran together had grown with the town, and when Dr. Fitch finally retired in 1885, at the age of 69, considerably longer than most of his colleagues had expected him to manage, on account of his constitution being considerably tougher than his round frame suggested. He left the practice entirely in her hands, and she ran it with the same precision and compassion and complete lack of interest in whether the applicable conventions approved that she had always brought to her work. She trained 2 young nurses over those years, women who came to her the way she had come to medicine, with more will and aptitude than the formal pathways had room for, needing someone to open a door. She opened the door. It was, she thought, the least she could do with what had been opened for her. Matthew was sheriff of Caldwell for 11 years, until 1890, when the changing nature of the town and the territory made the position something different from what it had been, and he made the decision to step back and let a younger man take the badge. He was not old 43 in 1890, but he had given the years of high vigilance that the job required and had enough of himself left, he said, to do something else with. He joined the town council, which Mamie observed with quiet amusement, and he took over the management of a horse trading operation that he had been informally involved with for years, and which turned out to suit him excellently. The work used everything he knew about horses and about people, and about the patient process of bringing complicated things to a good outcome. She was 41 in 1895, with 2 teenage children and a medical practice, and 17 years of a marriage that had given her more than she had known to hope for when she had stepped off a stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, with $40 sewn into the hem of her coat and a plan. The plan, it turned out, had been better than she knew, not because it had gone the way she had planned it. It had not precisely. It had gone sideways and complicated and full of things she had not anticipated, which was the nature of plans that were worth making, but because it had brought her here to this life, to this man, to this town that had become hers in all the ways that mattered. She was sitting on the porch of their house one evening in September, a proper house now, larger than the first one, with a porch that faced west so you could watch the sunsets over the plain, and the light was going that extraordinary amber and crimson again, the way it had gone the evening she had kissed Matthew for the first time on the step of Dr. Fitch's old office, and James was 17 and somewhere in the barn with the horses, which was where he was found most reliably. And Alina was 13 and inside doing what Alina did at 13, which was reading everything she could find and arguing with the conclusions. Matthew came out and sat beside her on the porch steps. He was 43 and he wore the years well, the lines deeper now and the gray more extensive and the quality of him not diminished but settled, the way that good things settle into themselves over time and become more fully what they are. He did not speak when he sat down. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him the way she had been leaning into him for 17 years, and they watched the sunset do its business over the western plain. She could still read every movement. She always could. And what his body said now, his arm around her and his warmth beside her, and the way he exhaled when he sat down with her, that particular quality of a man who has arrived at the place where he is entirely himself. What it said was what it had always said, more clearly with every year that accumulated, the same thing he had told her with his presence before he had the words, and had been telling her with both ever since. She thought about the girl she had been in St. Louis, reading everything she could find about medicine by lamplight after a 16-hour day at the hospital, trying to build something real from determination and very little else. She thought about the stagecoach and the dust and the dart of light that a badge had thrown across a main street the first afternoon she arrived. She thought about chamomile growing along a building foundation, and a paper-wrapped parcel and creekwater eyes, and a man who had been so carefully closed against the world that she had needed to read every small movement of him to understand that he was, underneath all that careful management, a man who had been quietly waiting for something real. She had been that something real. He had been hers. "James asked me today about the early days," Matthew said. "What Caldwell was like when you came. What did you tell him?" "That it was loud and dusty and I couldn't say why I kept coming to Dr. Fitch's office when I didn't need to be there." She smiled. "And," the corner of his mouth moved, "and that there was a woman who gave me coffee when I didn't ask for it and could read exactly what I needed before I knew I needed it, and that I was very lucky she arrived when she did and stayed." "Very diplomatic," she said. "I told him the truth," Matthew said. She looked at him. He looked back at her, with those creekwater eyes that the years had only made more themselves, and what she read in them was what she had been reading in them for 17 years, and what she would read in them as long as she had the extraordinary luck of being beside him to look certainty and steadiness, and the particular quality of a man who has found the thing that was worth finding, and has never, not for a single day, taken it for granted. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said, and the warmth in his voice was everything. Then, because he had learned over 17 years that she was right, that words mattered, and he had worked at them for her the way he worked at anything worth doing. "I love you, more than I knew it was possible to love something." He paused. "Anyone." He corrected himself, and the slight roughness of the correction, the honesty in catching himself toward the more accurate word, was so perfectly him that she felt it somewhere deep and permanent. James came out of the barn then, tall at 17, and his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, and the beginning of the man he was becoming already visible in the way he moved, with a purposefulness and a quality of attention that had come from watching both of his parents their whole life. Eleanor appeared in the doorway behind them, book in hand, immediately assessing the scene on the porch and deciding that it warranted her presence. And she came and sat on the step beside her father's knee with the particular imperious comfort of a girl who has always known she is loved and has arranged herself accordingly. They were all together on the porch in the September light, watching the plane turn colors in the going-down sun, and Mamie thought of everything that had brought her here, the death of her father and the hard years in St. Louis, and the $40 sewn into a hem and a letter of introduction, and the particular bold hope of a 24-year-old woman who had decided that somewhere out there was a place that needed someone and she was that someone. She had found the place. She had built the life. She had read every movement of the man who had been waiting, closed as a door, for something real to find him, and she had been patient, and she had been certain, and she had been right. The plain stretched out westward in the last of the afternoon light, vast and golden and beautiful in the way they had always been beautiful to her, the world cracking open to show a size she hadn't known existed, and Matthew's arm was around her and her children were beside her, and the town of Caldwell moved through its quiet autumn evening at their backs, and everything that needed to be built had been built, and everything that needed to be resolved had been resolved, and everything that needed to be found had been found. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. He was exactly who she had known he was from the very first afternoon, from that first dart of light across a dusty Main Street, from the first moment she had read his stillness and known that underneath it was something vast and deep and completely worth the patience it would take to arrive at. He had not been a man who spoke of feelings. She had not been a woman who needed him to. She had read every movement, every careful, deliberate gesture, every word spoken sideways, and every silence that said more than words could carry. And what she had read all along was this: here is a man who will love you in the language he knows, which is the language of showing up and staying and doing the work and being there, every day completely, for as long as there are days. And there, in the September light of 1895, on the porch of the house they had made together, with the plains going gold and her children beside her, and the man she loved with his arm around her shoulders, and everything they had built spread out around them like evidence of everything that had been possible, she was content in the complete and certain way of someone who has arrived at the life they were building toward without knowing its full shape, and who has found it to be beyond any reasonable expectation, exactly enough and also somehow more. The sun went down over the Kansas plain. The stars came out, the ones she had learned to love in the years she had been here, brilliant and close in the way they were close on the open land. James went back to the horses eventually, because he always went back to the horses. Elena read until the light was too low and then went inside to find a lamp, because Elena always found a lamp. Matthew stayed beside her on the porch, his arm around her, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and the quiet between them was the quiet of two people who have said everything important and continue to say it without sound, in every breath and every presence, in the language they had always used best. It was enough. It was everything. It was the life they had built together, from the particular combination of her reading every movement, and his making every movement mean something, in a wild and extraordinary place at the edge of the settled world, in the extraordinary ordinary years of a life that had started with $40 in a hem, and ended with everything that mattered spread out around her in the deep September dark. Mamie Langston Monroe sat on her porch in Caldwell, Kansas, with the man she loved beside her and the stars overhead, and the plains breathing in the dark at the edge of the town that had become hers, and she was, completely and without qualification, home.